Okay, so folks,
Anyway.
I'm Joe Lombardo. I'm the co-coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the title of this panel is Democrats and Republicans, the Twin Parties of Imperialist War. We were meant to have 4 panelists. One of them pulled out his back and couldn't get here from California, and that's Jeff Mackler. So at the end, I might say a couple of words in his place. The other panelists, and I'll introduce them more as...
He was just on Skype on another panel. Too bad you don't have him on Skype.
We thought about that. We talked about it, and he said, "You be me at this panel." So we have Jamal Baraka will be speaking. We have Margaret Kimberly will be speaking, and Abayomi Azikwe, and I will give them a fuller introduction as they come up and speak. But the first speaker has to be Margaret Kimberly, who is a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee, an editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report, and she's first because she has a conflict with another panel. So she's going to speak here first and then speak there later, so we won't have the benefit of her during the question and discussion period, but the rest of us will be here. So let's start with Margaret, and then we'll go down the line.
Okay. Thank you. For myself. Thank you all, and I thank everybody for their forbearance that I can't stay, and I apologize to the rest of the panelists who I would love to hear. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start by saying I found it hard to put these remarks together about foreign policy, and I'm going to blame Donald Trump because I blame him for everything. But also, there's so many contradictions with Trump, and that are pretty significant. So I'm hoping to be coherent. But anyway. Trump he's a Republican. He's certainly on the right. He won by the Electoral College victory by appealing to white nationalist sentiment, that is to say racism. Putting America first was clearly understood to mean put white people first. And I was surprised by his victory in retrospect. I don't think I should have been. I think that calling for a wall on the Mexican border probably won him the presidency months before I was paying attention. But he also, and this is a difficulty that I have in talking about him sometime, he also said things that made him enemies among some of the ruling class. For example, trade deals such as TPP and NAFTA. He says he'll renegotiate them, who knows. But that is messing with the money of the 1%. Helping capitalists move their capital is an unquestioned goal of U.S. foreign policy. At least it was until he came along. So was continuing war by other means against Russia and attempting Russia to capitulate and cede power to America and give up some of its sovereignty. So these things present problems for foreign policy orthodoxy. On the other hand, he stands firmly with the continuity of U.S. foreign policy. It was just about 2 months ago that he attacked Syria with the missile strike. The case was cooked up, of course, gas attack carried out by terrorist forces in Syria, and it was used to bring him back into line when he said that regime change might not be a goal of foreign policy. Carving it up maybe, but not regime change. But anyway, you see how hard this all can be. So the Democrats would have us believe that Trump is completely antithetical to them, that his administration is some low point for democracy and they want nothing to do with him or his policies. But what did they say when he attacked Syria with those missiles? Some, like Hillary Clinton, openly praised him. They said it was the right thing to do. Others waffled. Some said he should have gone to Congress first to ask permission. Now, they didn't say they would have opposed him. They just said he should have asked first. And I actually wish he had, because then they would have had to go on record as to where they stood. The War Party is completely bipartisan. There are no Democrats or Republicans when it comes to upholding hegemony and imperialism around the globe. Let's look at recent history. We have to go back and talk about Obama a bit. He was credited with being the anti-war candidate when he first ran in 2008. And that was so clearly untrue. And the fact that the corporate media let him get away with making that claim is proof that he was the choice of the ruling elite all along. In fact, he said when he was asked, if you'd been in the Senate for the vote on the war with Iraq, what would you have done? And he said he didn't know. He said he wasn't against all wars, just dumb wars. He never made it clear what made a war dumb or not, but it was a signal that he was going to uphold all the prerogatives of U.S. imperialism. And when he won his undeserved Nobel Peace Prize, he used his speech to talk about why war is necessary. So yes, he did say that war is peace. So fast forward to 2017, and what did we witness during his presidency? Apparently he concluded that dumb wars were those that didn't involve sending Americans. He didn't send U.S. soldiers to Libya or to attempt to destroy Syria. He used the tried and true method of sending jihadists backed by Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia. He used the color revolution in Ukraine to bring neo-Nazis to power, to threaten and provoke the Russians. So George W. Bush, if you can remember that far back, said he wasn't in favor of nation building or regime change either. And he certainly didn't remember he said those words and invaded Iraq. Obama never used that word, regime change. He talked about the responsibility to protect and made the claim that Libyans and Syrians wanted their countries to be destroyed. So along comes Trump, who said he didn't want regime change either. He does say things like we should do something, whatever that means, about Iran and China and North Korea. With Trump, it's never clear what he means or what he wants. He did say repeatedly he wanted better relations with Russia. He said that often enough, but we don't know exactly what that means. And in any case now, those words are pretty worthless because his overtures to Russia have been used to claim that Vladimir Putin somehow handed him the presidency. But Trump is like his predecessors in that he offers more continuity. And we saw that on his recent trip, foreign trip last week. In Saudi, he went to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and the NATO and G7 summits in Europe. And it was interesting, when he was in Saudi Arabia, we saw how little the elites like him and how much they still depend on Obama. Trump announced an arms sale, $100 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, which is roughly the same amount of arms selling that Obama did with Saudi Arabia. And those weapons have been used against Yemen since 2015 in this horrible genocidal war. The bombing, the blockade of Yemen has resulted in starvation, in a cholera epidemic. But according to, among others, Obama's friends at the New York Times, the former president didn't really want this to happen. They had an editorial entitled, "Will Trump Save Yemen?" And they implored Trump to undo what Obama did without any complaint from them. They made no reference to Obama's eagerness. I don't know if any of you remember, he went on a state visit to India and cut the visit short because the past king of Saudi Arabia had passed away. So he goes running to Saudi Arabia just to make sure that all those ducks are still in a row. So they're America's partner in crime, and they still are. And it was almost funny. Even Samantha Power, who was his UN ambassador, she went on Twitter criticizing the Saudis, and for some reason thought nobody in social media was going to notice. But people took her to task, and I'm glad that she did. But here's Obama. He's still being trotted out to meet with world leaders. So first he endorsed the new president of France, Macron, which is something we're not supposed to do. It's such a terrible thing to be involved in the politics of another country, but he endorsed him, he met him, he made a commercial for him. And last week, he made a public appearance with Angela Merkel in Germany. Now, it wasn't called a campaign appearance, but clearly that's what it was. So the former president is more a favorite of some among the 1% than the current president. So it all can be confusing, but some things are still very clear. Trump was at the NATO summit, and the only thing that most Americans know is that he shoved the president of Montenegro out of the way. But the important things to which I don't want anybody shoving me out of the way, so I don't want to excuse that, but I think it's important to say that NATO is not some august institution that ought to be revered. It's an enemy of peace and works hand in hand. It is America's outpost of imperialism in Europe. When the Soviets stood down, when Gorbachev just unilaterally removed troops from Eastern Germany, remember we were supposed to have a peace dividend or something? Well, that didn't happen. So all we got was an expansion of NATO to the former Soviet allies. And when Libya was destroyed, and this is something that particularly resonates with me because Libya was a place that especially black Americans always felt in solidarity with until they were in Obama's crosshairs, and then everybody forgot. But at any rate, after the dirty deed was done, the then Prime Minister of the UK, the then President of France, went to Libya personally to gloat and to dance on Gaddafi's grave. So I have my own reasons, many reasons, for not liking Trump, but the fact that NATO has its collective nose out of joint about him is not among my concerns. And that brings me to another important point. I think it's a mistake to focus so much on Trump that we become confused. It doesn't matter to me if NATO was weak. Why is it a problem for NATO to be weak? Or Angela Merkel says we're going to have to go it alone. We can't trust America anymore. Well, so what? I don't see that as being a problem. Now, I'm not like, this is the odd thing about Trump. He may say some part of something that I've said, not ever for the same reason. I don't see NATO nations as deadbeats who don't pay their dues. That's certainly not my concern. But my concern is that these imperial alliances fall apart. So I think when all is said and done, we have to stay our course, no matter who in the duopoly happens to be in power, because the goals of U.S. foreign policy never change. We have to oppose interventions all the time and uphold the doctrine of sovereignty of all nations. And that can sometimes be difficult to do because there are people who deliberately confuse us. For example, I have no problem at all defending President Assad of Syria and his right to defend his country from attack, from the US, from NATO, from the Saudis, from Turkey, from Israel, from ISIS. Did I leave anybody out? And of course we're told he's a butcher. And I love how they make up these words for anybody the US government doesn't like, and they're trying to make us not like them also. No American president's ever called a butcher. No American ally is ever called a butcher. These words exist just for people that our government is trying to crush. I think invading Iraq and killing 1 million people ought to qualify George W. Bush for butcherhood or butcherosity or whatever you want to call it. We can't be confused when the U.S. put neo-Nazis in power in Ukraine. Imagine, suppose Canada or Mexico had a political crisis and Vladimir Putin chose sides and put his party in power. Would that be okay with any American president? Of course, the answer is no. So that's something to keep in mind when we're told he's evil, a demon, blah, 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 blah. And lastly, I want to talk about the corporate media and the role they play in upholding this system. Much is being made these days about the term fake news, which as far as I can tell is what we've always been exposed to. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was fake news. When Colin Powell went to the UN in 2003 and allegedly made some bogus case that there was WMD in Iraq, that was fake news, and the cheerleading from the corporate media, from the New York Times and Washington Post, was fake news. Barack Obama hasn't shut up about fake news since election night. And that's because of the way Trump changed things. His victory threatened the system in some of the ways I've discussed, but it was the result of elite consensus being delegitimized. And that's a threat to the 1% and to the corporate media. We have other sources of information, so they have to tell us not to listen to them. And that's why the Washington Post recently, they changed their masthead, I think only online. It says, "Democracy dies in darkness," as if the Washington Post really believes in democracy. That's why they have to put up a front group, propaganda or not, to discredit voices like those of us at Black Agenda Report. But we can't talk about them without mentioning that the Post's sole owner is Jeff Bezos. He's the founder of Amazon, which has a $600 million contract with the CIA. And he's one of the richest people on the planet. One of those 8 people whose net worth totals the same as the net worth of the poorest people on the planet. So this isn't someone who's going to give us anything but fake news. And I point this out because we can't fight against imperialist wars without calling attention to how they get popular support. There are millions of Syrian refugees because of the United States. They weren't leaving their country en masse until the regime change effort began. But are we ever told that in corporate media? Do they ever tie Obama's name to this humanitarian crisis or to the refugee crisis in Libya that sends people across the Mediterranean Sea, and to some African migrants into slavery, which I have not yet seen in an American newspaper. I've seen it in The Guardian, I've seen it in other places. I have not seen mention of that if somebody else has, please let me know. But the crimes are hidden in plain sight by their lies, and it's our job to expose them and to stand firm against the continued violation of human rights around the world by the United States, whether the person in the White House has a D or an R behind his name. Thank you very much.
I didn't time Margaret because she's going to not be able to participate in the discussion anyway, but everybody else I'm going to time them for 12 minutes if that's okay with everybody, and then we will have some discussion at the end. I also want to point your attention to the table there. There's some UNAC literature, including a flyer for our conference, which will be held, our next national conference, which will be held in Richmond, Virginia, on the weekend of the 16th through the 18th of June, so in about 2 weeks. And if you can get down there, I urge you to do it. It's our first attempt to do something in what some people consider the South. Because we've had a growth of some organizations that have been working with UNAC in the South. So we hope it will be a successful conference, and we urge you to go. Our next speaker is going to be Abayomi Azikwe, who is from the Pan-African Newswire. He is a founding member of the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice. He is also a member of the Administrative Committee of UNAC.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank everyone for coming out to this panel. This is a very broad topic. I want to focus somewhat on United States foreign policy towards Africa since World War II to show the continuity of imperialist policies carried out by both the Democratic and the Republican Party just since World War II. And the only way you can do that, you have to select certain countries to focus on because we could be here all night discussing this topic. It is so vast. There's so much intervention, and there's such a profound history of it from Washington as well as Wall Street. Now, these developments do not take place in a vacuum. So I would just want to touch on very briefly some of the other consistent U.S. foreign policy imperatives that impact other geopolitical regions. Now, with the ascendancy of President Donald Trump to the White House, a strong focus has been placed by his critics on his role as a promoter of racism, of national oppression inside the United States, but also warmongering abroad. Now, just recently we've observed the escalation of tensions in the Korean Peninsula with the placement of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, missile system, THAAD. People have heard of that, of course. The president's posture in relationship to the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known in the United States as North Korea, just several weeks ago threatened the full resumption of an unresolved war in that area of the world. There has never been a peace treaty between the United States and the DPRK. There's an armistice agreement that was signed in 1953, so technically the U.S. Ruling class is still at war with the DPRK. Now, there's been increasing aerial attacks against purported, and I say purported, al-Qaeda targets in Yemen. When Trump came in, of course, he ordered, well, it was supposedly was ordered before he came in, but it was carried out under him a commando raid on a village in Yemen that killed a number of people and also resulted in the death of a U.S. Navy SEAL. While at the same time, the people in Yemen, which is the most underdeveloped state in the Middle East, is suffering immensely from a Pentagon-coordinated war that involves Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council. They've been bombing the country daily since March of 2015. An estimated 12,000 people have been killed. Now, these are official estimates. Some people say it's a lot more. And it's prompted widespread outbreaks of cholera that's impacted officially some 60,000 people in Yemen. Outrageous completely. Now, Trump goes to Saudi Arabia recently and, of course, says nothing about the suffering of the people in Yemen. The Saudi officials talk about Iranian influence in Yemen. This is their basis for intervention. Trump has identified the Islamic Republic of Iran as a principal enemy in the region. And at the same time, you see in the corporate media this whole issue not even being covered. For example, about 2 days ago, I read an Associated Press article that mentioned a Saudi Arabian campaign in Yemen. It said nothing about the aerial bombardments, said nothing about the Qatari special forces that have been deployed there. It said absolutely nothing about the forces that back the ousted President Hadi, ground forces that are operating particularly in southern Yemen. So there's a total effort to hide, the atrocities that are being committed in Yemen, which is right across the Gulf of Aden from the Horn of Africa. There are African people in Yemen who have been there for thousands and thousands of years. Also, the deployment of the massive ordnance air blasts, MOAB, commonly known as the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan several weeks ago, represented a new level of warfare in that Central African country, which has been the focus of U.S. foreign policy at least since 1979, when the Islamist forces, who they say now are their enemies, were funded and unleashed against the Soviet-backed socialist-oriented government that was in power in Afghanistan. You don't hear too much about that in the media, that U.S. imperialism supported the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan beginning in the late 1970s through the 1980s. They would visit the United States under the Reagan administration and be praised as freedom fighters, as proponents of democracy, just as the Contras in Nicaragua and the UNITA bandits in Angola. So these are some of the developments that have been taking place. The United States has had ground troops in Afghanistan for nearly 16 years with no end in sight whatsoever. It's not even a discussion about withdrawing from Afghanistan. Obama said he was withdrawing combat troops from there, but he said the thousands upon thousands of troops that are there, CIA personnel, military trainers, private contractors, are there in an advisory and a training capacity. Yet, occasionally you do hear about U.S. forces being killed in Afghanistan. Now, I want to get to the African continent. I want to just talk about 4 countries very briefly. Now, although the Trump administration's foreign policy towards Africa has gained far less attention by the Western media, there's been a continuation of the already existing hostilities on the African continent. Somalia in the Horn of Africa, oil-rich nation, been suffering immensely over the last several decades. Trump singled out Somalia. He ordered the escalation of Pentagon and Central Intelligence Agency personnel being stationed in this Horn of Africa state, saying he was, quote, lifting the, quote, restraint that had been imposed by Barack Obama in regard to U.S. forces in Somalia. There was no restraint under the previous administration. They fund the African Union mission to Somalia, some 22,000 troops. They help train them. Since 2007, they've been involved in bombing campaigns in Somalia that have killed innocent civilians under the guise of fighting against al-Qaeda and ISIS-linked terrorists. A Special Forces soldier was killed by al-Shabaab guerrilla units just several weeks ago while they were embedded in the U.S. and European Union-backed Somali National Army. Came out, even in the corporate media, that this Navy SEAL that was killed was actually on a maneuver against al-Shabaab with the Somali National Army. Now, although the administration claims that it was doing away with the supposed restrictions on military activities in Somalia by former President Barack Obama, the interventions by the U.S. in Somalia go back as far as the late 1970s, when it encouraged an invasion by the government of the then President Mohammed Siad Barre against the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, where the Somali population are a majority in that area. Another Democratic presidential incumbent at that time was Jimmy Carter, when all this went on in 1978. He was in the Oval Office at that time. During the waning days of the presidential tenure of George H.W. Bush Sr., it was marked by the invasion of 12,000 Marines into Somalia in a failed, what they call Operation Restore Hope, that began in December of 1992. This was a plan that was inherited by Bill Clinton when he came in office in January of 1993, which ended in disaster when people rose up against the occupation. They made a movie called Black Hawk Down. Well, that was just a sensationalistic portrayal of what actually happened. I mean, it was very fierce urban guerrilla warfare resistance to U.S. forces there. Since 2007, the U.S., then under President George W. Bush Jr., has encouraged and sponsored the intervention into Somalian national affairs by contiguous states in the Horn of Africa. First, by seeking to empower warlords to subvert the efforts of the Union of Islamic Courts. That was in 2006, and then later, encouraging the Ethiopian military, which is now allied with the United States, to intervene, which they did in 2007. And then after 2009, where they split the Union of Islamic Courts, some of them were brought into the interim federal regime in Somalia, Washington sought to guide the political events in this oil-rich state. Now, several neighboring states have been drawn into the African Union mission to Somalia, AMISOM, which now has approximately 22,000 troops. These troops come from Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, where the U.S. has a AFRICOM base stationed in Djibouti with thousands of U.S. troops, as French troops are also there as well. And they also utilized for the war against Yemen. Burundi, which is in the eastern part of Central Africa, and Uganda, which has also played a major role with the United States over the last 2 decades in U.S. militarist policies, principally in East and Central Africa. They have police officers there from Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, and they're also a part of this same mission. Moving on, in the southern African nation of Zimbabwe since 1998, the former British colonial power, the United States, the European Union, among others, have imposed draconian sanctions on the government there. The government is headed by the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front. The president, Robert Mugabe, has been in power there since 1980, when in 2000, the parliament in Zimbabwe passed legislation granting the right of the indigenous African people to radically redistribute land to the people. The sanctions and other forms of hostile propaganda were enacted. The whole struggle in Zimbabwe was for the reclaiming of the land, which was stolen during the latter part of the 19th century by people such as Cecil Rhodes and the mining firms, gold and diamond mining firms in Zimbabwe. They also have platinum there. It's a very rich nation, but it's been strangled economically because they dared to take millions and millions of hectares of land from the white British settlers. Now, both Britain and the United States attempted to persuade the Republic of South Africa, when Thabo Mbeki was in office, to impose a blockade on Zimbabwe, which they absolutely refused to do because Zimbabwe is basically a landlocked state. Britain drew up plans for an evacuation of its settler population, they also held UK passports. So they're Zimbabwean citizens, ostensibly. They owned most of the land inside the country, but at the same time, they still held British passports. Just think about that. Okay, now, these suggestions failed through the assistance of successive African National Congress governments in South Africa, the support of the regional Southern Africa Development Community, which refused to condemn Zimbabwe, and the People's Republic of China, the country which has supplied a lot of assistance to Zimbabwe, and they have been able to remain afloat over the last 17 years. Now, this, of course, was not the case in the North African nation of Libya, where under the Jamhuriya system headed by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the oil-rich country had attained the highest standard of living of anywhere on the African continent. It was the Democratic administration of Barack Obama, with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, which coordinated a war of regime change and genocide that destroyed Libya as a viable state. Gaddafi was driven out of the capital of Tripoli in August of 2011, and later captured and brutally murdered by imperialist agents on October 20th of 2011. Today, Libya is a major source of instability and human trafficking internationally. Thousands have died off the coast of the country in the Mediterranean in attempts to flee the chaos and the impoverishment which now characterizes the country. There are at least 3 identifiable governments in Libya, which often engage in deadly military struggles for political and economic authority. We just saw what happened in Tripoli several days ago. The country has gone from Africa's most prosperous to dire poverty and balkanization due to imperialist intervention. Numerous attempts by counter-revolutionary elements backed by the White House, the European Union member states, and the United Nations to form a viable regime has failed over the last 6 years. So these are just 2 examples, and we can get into more examples during the question and answer period, but clearly we have Republican administrations, Democratic administrations that are advancing the same imperialist policy in Africa, even under John F. Kennedy, who's considered a liberal, who is, lionized today. He was the first chair of the subcommittee of the Senate Subcommittee on Africa of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He began that committee in 1959, positioning himself to run for president in 1960. So we can discuss this during the question and answer. Thank you for your attention.
Our next speaker is Jamal Baraka, who is a longtime human rights activist. Most recently, he ran as vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, and he's now involved in a very exciting project. He's organizing a group called the Black Alliance for Peace. I think everybody who's conscious understands that anti-war sentiment in the black community has always been highest. And the question is to organize that sentiment into a force that can help make a change. And so this project is a very significant project, in my opinion. Recently, UNAC and Black Alliance for Peace did a joint statement on Venezuela, which you could see on the table here if you'd like to pick it up. This is Jamal Baraka.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. I appreciate all of you being here this afternoon. I thank UNAC for allowing me to be a part of this panel, especially with my dear brother here who's been in the trenches for such a long time and bringing such quality information to us for such a long time. It's an honor to be sharing this panel with him also, and with Margaret, of course. My comments would be relatively simple and to the point. I think the argument has been laid out, the evidence presented, that both parties are equally implicated in terms of the advancement of U.S. imperialism and the systematic support given by the U.S. state to the oligarchy in the United States of America. And that reality, those politics, have been reflective of the politics of both political parties. As our dear brother just laid out, in terms of Africa and a couple of other examples like in Yemen, it's been fairly consistent that the U.S. Has used its military means to advance its interests. Now, there were differences at different points in history, but let's talk about that for a moment. After the end of the Second Imperialist War, or the Second World War as we know it, we know that the U.S. emerged as the most powerful nation in the West. It had the opportunity to become the leader of the Pan-European project, meaning that project of Western European states, including the U.S., that had risen to dominance over the course of the last, at that point, about 400 and something years, beginning in 1492 with the invasion of the Americas, a process that resulted in the creation of what we call the West. That process resulted in the development, economic development of the so-called West, and the economic, political, cultural, social underdevelopment of all of the nations that ended up colonized by Europe. That history created the material disparity between the West and the rest, okay? But because of their own internal contradictions, their inability to come to terms with the competition among themselves, among the various empires, the inability to transcend the crisis of 1873, and their attempt to try to address that crisis by engaging in more aggressive colonialism, including attempting to try to make sure that that could be done effectively with the Berlin Conference, where they carved up the African continent. We know that they failed. And by the turn of the 20th century, they were engulfed in capitalist, imperialist war among themselves. That resulted in the configurations of states that emerged after the First World War. The peace that came out, or so-called peace that came out of that process, didn't last long because the contradictions of capital and imperialism had not been resolved. They were just set aside. They took new forms. We had the Russian Revolution, the emergence of the Soviet Union, that came out of the vacuum that was created, came out of the chaos of the contradictions of capital and capitalism. By the 1920s, you had now another worldwide recession. And you had, in response to that, instead of revolutionary change that was being predicted by many, by revolutionary theory, you had instead at the beginning of the rise of fascism that led to, of course, the war, the Second Imperialist War, in which the Western nations allowed for the Nazis to rearm with the intent that they were going to allow the Nazis to do the business they had attempted right after the Russian Revolution, and that is to do away with the Soviet Union. But of course, Hitler had other plans, and of course, as part of the appeasement process, he moved west, kept on moving west until he dominated most of Western Europe. At that point, then he made his fatal error in attempting to then move to the east and move against the Soviet Union, and we know the history, that basically as a consequence of the Soviet peoples and the tremendous price that they paid, the Nazi regime and fascism was temporarily defeated at that point. The U.S. had laid back in the back for a while until they saw that there was going to be an opening and were able to maneuver themselves into the Second World War when they instigated conflict with the Japanese that then gave them the opening to then declare war on the Germans so they can get into the mix, anticipating that there was going to be a possibility that Germany was going to be defeated and they would emerge as a predominant power, which of course is what happened. At the end of that war, you had the U.S. emerging now as the most powerful nation. All of the other European nations were fundamentally wounded, unable to completely hold their colonies, but they attempted to do that. They attempted to try to hold some of those colonies with the assistance of the U.S., but the price they had to pay was that they had to allow the U.S. to basically sort of take charge, also penetrate those economies and to control those people. Domestically, there was a compromise with the U.S. emerging as the most powerful nation on this planet. There was the very famous labor capital compromise in which the agitation, the organizing that was taking place right before the war somewhat dissipated to a certain extent because now we had the good old days. We had the end of the war, we had the possibility of new prosperity, but the deal was that you would not engage in too militant of activities to attempt to dislodge and displace capital. And what you would get in return would be massive investments in new housing, roads that allowed for the working class to begin to emerge as the new so-called middle class. And they went out to the suburbs, they left the urban areas. Those areas, of course, were quickly filled by the second great migration of black folks from the South that went into those territories. So it was the good old days. We saw the TV programs in the 1950s and 60s and Leave It to Beaver and all those kind of programs where things were really, really nice. But for the vast majority of black people, it wasn't the good old days. Basically, part of the compromise was that beyond not opposing capital too aggressively, part of the compromise was that they were supposed to allow for segregation to continue, that we were going to be once again sacrificed. But we had our own plan, that after the Second World War, primarily under the leadership of many people who came back from that conflict, you had the human rights movement, the radical black human rights movement in the U.S. You had the National Negro Congress and the Civil Rights Congress. You had the NAACP that saw that the end of the war and the beginning of a new structure called the UN and the new configuration of power, because not only did the U.S. emerge as a dominant power, they weren't the only power. You had the Soviet Union and the so-called Eastern Bloc that was developing. So you had countervailing power there, which provided some political space for activists in the U.S. and other places. And radical black activists saw that and began to agitate for the end of racial oppression in the U.S., but also they agitated for ending colonialism. And that's what they in fact did. In the 1950s, that struggle intensified. It took the form in the beginnings of the civil rights struggles for democratic rights in the South. And so that upset the sort of agreement, because that struggle then, of course, bled into the North, because that's where the majorities of African people were beginning to concentrate. And the relative peaceful civil rights movement began to morph into a more militant and aggressive resistance that we have come to classify as a black liberation movement. a movement that was concerned not only with advancing the interests of black people, but also it was a movement that understood that we had a common enemy with people around the world, and that common enemy was the imperialist capitalist system. And that the conclusion was reached that the only way we're going to be able to advance our interests, our fundamental democratic rights, was that we had to do away with that system. So that upset the apple cart because we went to war, and they went to war on us. And we began to demand more. We weren't going to allow ourselves to be walled up into these ghettos. We weren't going to allow for ourselves to be shipped off to these various wars, fighting for them while we had no democratic rights in the U.S. And that was a very powerful opposition, because we know that one of the consequence of the U.S. emerging as this powerful nation after the Second World War was that in order to maintain its hegemony and to expand the influence of the West, they were involved in constant conflict, constant war, as we all know. That, began under both Democrats and Republicans. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the intervention in Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia. I mean, it goes on, Dominican Republic, it goes on and on, all of the military dictatorships that they imposed throughout Latin America. The anti-colonial fights that they were involved in. They sided with the colonists against African people who were fighting for liberation. The assassination of Lumumba, the balkanization of the African continent, the coup against Kwame Nkrumah. It is a blood-dripping history that this country is responsible for. And the result was that basically we have these contradictions. So this notion that the Democrats have been soft on war is a myth. This idea that what we are facing today is something that's new, it basically has no basis in reality. That what we have today is a continuation of this bloody history. But we have a new situation in that we all know the Soviet Union was collapsed, depending how you looked at it. And that countervailing power was no longer in place. We had a new aggressive policy emerging in the 1990s. And the centerpiece of that was full spectrum dominance. And that strategy of full spectrum dominance, that is for the ruling class in this country to be committed to maintaining their hegemony by any means necessary, was a policy embraced by both political parties. The only difference was that, for example, the Obama administration brought the smiling face of imperialism, soft power, and today you have the cruel power of Donald Trump. The difference with Donald Trump, though, is that he's been saying some things that were undercutting their strategy. And that's one of the reasons why the ruling class mobilized to delegitimize his presidency. But my time is up. I see Joe squirming. And so I'm going to end it here, and we can get into this more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Let me just say a couple of brief remarks, and then we'll get into the question and discussion period. I think the other speakers made it clear that these imperialist wars have continued under both administrations of Republicans and Democrats, and that both parties are parties of war, that war is basically a bipartisan issue in this country. In fact, it's partly the reason that UNAC was formed, because we understood that there was a need to have an independent movement, independent of these parties. When Obama was elected, a lot of the anti-war movement thought we were in a new era, that there was going to be peace. In any case, it's difficult to protest against the first black president. And so the anti-war movement kind of dissipated. From leaders of the previous coalition that existed in this country, anti-war coalition, I actually heard right after the election of Obama, but before he took the reins of office at the last conference that particular coalition held, was that they had heard that Obama was going to have a new cabinet position. It would be the Office of Peace. And that some of them might be considered for that position. I told them I didn't think so. But what did happen was the movement dissipated. The wars didn't end. And so some people got together at a conference up in Albany of 800 people and decided we need to continue with the anti-war movement. It's been a tough haul. It is very tough to do that. But the wars have continued. The wars have expanded. There's been continuous war. And it's very important to have an anti-war movement and to let the other movements that have been developing in the community against the militarization of the police, against mass incarceration, against the expulsion of immigrants from the country, that there's an international component to that, and the struggles are really the same. And so it's important for there to be an independent anti-war voice at this particular time. Now, the elections we went through were really strange, and the period since the election, in my opinion, has even been stranger. I've never seen, like the corporate media, spend 24/7 attacking the president. You know, why is that? What's going on? Well, it's clear that he was not the person that they wanted in power, but you know, this is what they're doing. And where does it come from? What does it mean? What does these strange politics mean? Well, first of all, the one point where they didn't attack him was when he went to war. Right. And he has increased the wars. He has escalated the wars. We heard of the troops on the ground in Yemen. We heard the introduction of more troops in Syria, the introduction of more troops in Iraq, the recent bombing of Syrian troops by the U.S. Military, the many civilian deaths around Mosul that have been caused by U.S. bombing. However, the dropping of the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. However, the real scary thing, in my opinion, is the escalation that's going on with the Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea. The media, just like they can say something, the media can say, all right, Hillary didn't really lose. Well, we know she got a couple of extra votes, and it was the Electoral College. Hillary didn't really lose. It was those Russians. I challenge someone to show me one piece of evidence they said that they showed to indicate that the Russians did this stuff. WikiLeaks said no, they didn't get it from the Russians. It was not a hacking that went on of the Democratic National Committee, but it was a leak from the Democratic National Committee that happened, because there was someone who was not very happy with the way they were not playing fair with Bernie Sanders. And they were not playing fair with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders does not have a great position on the wars or Palestine or these other things, but they were not playing fair. I remember watching CNN during the California primaries, and Hillary Clinton had a rally, and it had a couple of hundred people at it. They covered it word for word. At the same time, Sanders had a rally, and it had 40,000 people at it, and they mentioned that he had a rally. That's all they did. If they were going to defeat Trump, they needed to build the kind of enthusiasm that Bernie was building, regardless of what you think of his politics, that he was building among youth. And when they undercut him, what happened is those youths went home. There were more people who were eligible to vote in the last election who did not vote than there were people that voted for either of those two candidates. Hillary Clinton, they said, had the worst approval rating of any presidential candidate that ever existed in the history of presidential candidates in the United States, with the exception of Donald Trump. So somehow our lesser evil politics, our two-party politics, got us the two worst people we could imagine. And then they gave us that as a choice. Well, people said that was not a choice, and it was not a choice. Then they tried to say, well, she really won, it was these Russians. And Margaret showed me this, Margaret Kimberly. Here's Time magazine. They have this cynical-looking Putin. I know you can't see it from far away, so I'll have to explain this, but you can come up and take a look. And it says, the Russians want to undermine faith in the U.S. Elections. Don't fall for it. Well, Margaret found another Time magazine. This is in the early 90s. And the lead, it says there, is the secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. This led to the fall of the Soviet Union. The United States has intervened into the elections of just about every country. It creates opposition parties when it doesn't like the party that's in there. It gives them propaganda and gives them money. It does economic sanctions against the government in power so people will turn against it. This is what we're seeing going on in Venezuela in a real serious way at a very critical time right now, that we all have to come behind Venezuela right now. And if that doesn't work, they do a coup. They do it over and over. They have done it throughout the world. And if that doesn't work, they send in the military and do regime change. And that's what these wars are about all over the world that the United States is involved in. And they try to say, oh, this guy's bad, this guy's bad, this guy's bad. Yeah, there's a lot of bad guys in this world. But the real bad guys are the ones whose country we live in. We have around military bases in around 130 countries. We have around 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. The U.S. is the cause for war. We have to be clear on that. We have to oppose U.S. wherever they are. They will always say it's for humanitarian reasons. They will always say that to try to get the population behind them, but we have to oppose them. So now we got this stuff going on with North Korea. How many countries since the Korean War has North Korea attacked? Let me give you a hint. It's 0. How many has the United States attacked since then? Well, there's Vietnam, there was Cambodia, there was Laos, there was Cuba, remember the Bay of Pigs, Iraq, Afghanistan. I don't have enough fingers to go through all of that to tell you the truth. And yet, we're, in the United States, the biggest military power in the world, are supposed to be afraid of North Korea? During the Korean War, we killed about 1/3 of the population of that country. We bombed just about every building that stood. And when that was done and there was not much to bomb, we started bombing their dams to try to flood the people of Korea. That is a war crime, and the United States did it. It has done war crimes over and over and over again in the history of this world. And yet, why should they fear us? Twice they offered treaties to the United States. Those treaties were that they would stop their nuclear development if we would stop our threats against them. They stopped their nuclear development. We did not stop the threats against them. And so they continued their nuclear development. We have war games right on their borders, twice a year. The last one had 250,000 people in that war games with planes that flew over that were armed with nuclear weapons. Should they be fearing us, or are we fearing them? We've put THAAD missiles in South Korea. But North Korea is different than Iraq and Afghanistan. First of all, there's a tie to China. North Korea and China are nuclear powers. These aren't small armies like we've attacked and have not been able to win, even in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. And Russia, too, is a nuclear power. And we're surrounding Russia on all sides. I was just over at the NATO conference in Europe speaking about what's U.S. anti-war movement. Me and Ann Wright represented the U.S. anti-war movement, where someone mentioned the Black Hawk Down. She was involved in the Black Hawk Down on the wrong side of that issue. She was in the U.S. side trying to stop the people then. But little by little, her conscience was eating away at her. And during the Iraq War, she was the ambassador to Mongolia, and she said, I had enough, fuck this. She quit. She thought she wasn't going to even be able to get a pension. She didn't care. She was able to get a pension. And she's been one of the most consistent anti-war activists ever since. So we went together there in Europe, where we are surrounding Russia, but we're threatened by Russia. They interfere in our elections. The United States is the power that threatens everybody around the world, and we have to put an end to it, and it's a power, and these wars are bipartisan wars. We have to understand that. We have to have an independent anti-war movement. I encourage you all to join that movement. UNAC, as I mentioned, has a conference coming up in 2 weeks. We have a mailing list there. Please sign it. Please join us. The issues of war are not going away. They are only increasing. War is a permanent part of politics in this country and this world today, and it all stems from Washington and Wall Street. Thank you. So let's have some questions, discussion. Raise your hand. All right, I got 1, 2, 3, 4. Go on. 5. Okay. We'll call on others. But let's do this, and then we'll have people respond. We'll start with those 5. And please keep it short.
Okay, I'll do that. So first of all, just thank you all for your work. I mean, it's been so striking that while there has relatively been this major upsurge in activism on a whole range of issues around the war, that the anti-war movement still seems largely dormant. So I guess I have a couple of questions around that. First of all, why do you think that's the case? And then, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from past anti-war organizing? And here where I'm most interested is that it seems to me back in the Vietnam War organizing, there was sort of always this kind of tension between how do you get lots of people out versus how do you actually create a movement that's anti-imperialist and actually supports national liberation. So we saw when you had very broad politics, we got lots of people out, and then as soon as the draft ended, that was the end of it. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but I guess what for you are some of the key lessons in terms of, you know, building a movement that's actually powerful enough to, you know, take on imperialism, stop the wars, but that has enough principle to it that it's not just...
Good question.
Yeah.
Let's go to this man.
A quick question and then a point of information for exchange. Ajamu, can a brother who's melanin challenged be part of Black Alliance for Peace?
This question?
Yes.
We'll answer all the questions now. Let's just try to get through
Okay,
all 5.
thank you. I wanted to get you to smile. Point of information. Obama selected James McNerney, the president of Boeing, to chair the President's Export Council. He selected Marilyn Houston, president of Lockheed Martin, to sit on the President's Export Council. Hillary Clinton sat on the Export Council. That was to advise on the trade agreements. They worked hand in hand to negotiate the THAAD missile system into South Korea. They worked hand in hand to lift the arms embargo against Vietnam, profit for the arms manufacturer. The Clinton Foundation gets a tremendous amount of money channeled into it. Obama Foundation is now waiting in line. That's just a point of information for conversation for later.
Thank you.
Ajamu gave us a great, history. very comprehensive, except there was one area I want to fill in, which is Asia, because a couple of interesting things that happened centered there that coincide with everything else. Obviously, first you had Japan invading China and Korea, and the United States watching that unfold, swooping in and taking over what Japan occupied, basically by occupying Japan, kind of the same game they did with Europe and some of the colonies. And then, of course, the Chinese Revolution occurs there. And then at the time in the early 50s that you start to have people here organizing the human rights movement, you have Bandung and the dynamic that all that sets. So it shows even more, more comprehensively globally, like how integrated all these processes are. So I just wanted to throw that extra data in.
Yes, you're next.
Ajamu had mentioned that socialists thought in the 1930s that recession would automatically lend itself to socialism. I'm wondering why would they think that, and why, and I understand why it ended up being fascism, but what would have them believing that it would just become socialism?
Okay. One more, and we'll answer the questions, and then we'll go and have another
Question.
round. Go on.
Question. Have you thought about or have reached out to all the unions to go against these wars and take a stand? Because I don't see any unions except for one or two that have. And my next question is, what about, we could pressure, we could go to our politicians, but the money, it's all in our pockets. Where are our pensions going? And have we pressured our local controllers and state controllers to divest in companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing that provide weapons of mass destruction to the world?
Why don't you start?
Okay. Well, in terms of why the anti-war sentiment has been submerged in the anti-Trump demonstrations that, they actually started during the campaign last year, but after November, every day, right past the place where I live in Detroit, and young people marching by, taking over the streets. And then, of course, after he got in office, we were in Washington, D.C. Sarah Flounders was there. She's here from the International Action Center. And, thousands, more people in the streets demonstrating against Trump than there were, looking at the inauguration, particularly right there in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I think that it's a very complex issue. The domestic crisis in the United States is so intense right now, it tends to overshadow foreign policy issues. And I think that's very unfortunate because there's a clear link between the escalation of saber rattling against North Korea, or whether it's the escalation of U.S. military presence in Syria, Somalia, what's happening now in Venezuela, which is reaching a very, very critical point. And I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of building public opinion, doing political education work around these foreign policy issues. And I think, as Joe mentioned, during the Obama administration, some people felt that there was going to be some peace dividend, which they talked about after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Comic-Con sector in the late 80s and the early 1990s. That peace dividend was never paid to the masses at all. We still have huge military budgets. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of mobilizing people around these issues. I think what's happening now in Venezuela provides us with an excellent opportunity to raise the stakes in regard to U.S. foreign policy. I think there's going to be a demonstration here Tuesday. There's going to be one in Detroit. I'm from Detroit on Tuesday as well, downtown. Where's the anti-war movement on the Venezuelan question? I remember about a decade ago, I was in Washington, D.C., had a Venezuela Solidarity Conference. It's about 600, 700, 800 people showed up. Broad spectrum of people from different organizations. We need something like that now, a Venezuela Solidarity Conference organized to actually build support in defense of the Bolivarian Revolution. I mean, this is clearly an attack not just against Venezuela, but it's also an attack against Cuba, against Ecuador, against Bolivia, against the whole process of unification, cooperation between states in South America and the Caribbean, and a pushback against the Organization of American States, which is, in a way, leading this whole attack against Venezuela right now. So these are things that we need to do. The UNAC conference is in 2 weeks. You know, we want people to come out to this conference. I'm thinking it's going to be live streamed for people who can't be there. They can participate in that particular regard. I think it's just the International Action Center call for this nationwide demonstration against Venezuela. We need more organizations involved in this process. People can organize demonstrations in their local cities this coming week. It's days of action in defense of the people of Venezuela, even if they're small demonstrations. They can attract media attention, and they can show that people are concerned. When they bombed Syria several weeks ago, we called the demonstration the next day in downtown Detroit at Campus Martius, right across from Quicken Loans LLC. And, you know, we drew about maybe 100 people, mostly young people. And the media did come out and cover it, and it got wide coverage. So these are the type of activities. We have to get out in the streets, we have to hold conferences, even legislative initiatives. I don't necessarily know how effective they are, but if these people start getting bombarded with emails, with letters, with phone calls saying, you know, we don't want another war in Latin America, we don't want another war in the Middle East, it can have an impact. In 2013, Obama was preparing to do an aerial bombardment against Syria. And people were able to mobilize in this country as well as in Britain, and they had to back down. Now they have other ways of destabilizing Syria, which we have to be cognizant about as well. It's a very complicated situation that's going on right now internationally. We saw in the Philippines just a couple of days ago an attack on a casino there, which was ISIS claimed responsibility for. But, you know, these type of things are being done in an effort to demobilize anti-war sentiment in the United States. Now we know, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of these so-called Islamist groups have been utilized by the United States and by NATO against governments which are targeted for regime change. Same thing is happening in Syria, it happened in Libya, and all of a sudden now ISIS is popping up in all these different geopolitical regions of the world, as providing a rationale for more U.S. military intervention. So, Ajamu may want to comment on that as well.
No, I agree with everything you laid out in terms of what needs to be done. But I think that we have to also look at this in a slightly different way in terms of why don't we have a consistent and clear anti-war message? I would argue that we don't have that coming from not only liberals, but even from the left, because we don't seem to understand that we now live in a right-wing country, and that shift to the right ideologically and culturally has also impacted what we define or used to define as the left. We have a left in this country that is now so confused that it has, in many cases, objectively aligned itself with imperialism. We have a pro-imperialist left, in my opinion. And that's why we have the confusion around where should we stand on issues of the intervention in Libya and Syria. That's why we can have a politician that is defined as progressive, who can then take progressive domestic positions, but not be required to say anything progressive or take any kind of progressive position when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. In fact, can say some things that are objectively backward, like the Saudis need to get their hands dirty in the Middle East. and get away with it. That to me is a reflection of the rightist character of politics here in this country. Now, there's another element to this, in my opinion. One of the reasons why we have moved to the right and why war has become normalized is because of the hegemony, the unquestioned hegemony of white supremacist ideology. This notion that the white man's burden is a legitimate stance, that European, Euro-Americans have a right and a responsibility to bring order to the world, that the U.S. is the exceptional country, the indispensable country, the country that has the right to punish those states that step out of line, and it is accepted. When Trump decided that it was the responsibility of the U.S. to punish the Assad regime because of their supposed use of gas, even the language that they used, you sound like the big daddy, the big white daddy. You know, and it was accepted. There was no pushback on that. The whole savior, white savior phenomenon is based on what? You know, the U.S. and in the West, they'll go to the aid of those people who they perceive to be those victims who just want to be like us. But they under the thumb of these brutal dictators, Libya, and you fill in the blank. Okay? And that's all right. This whole notion of humanitarian intervention has been one of the most powerful weapons that was given to the state, primarily coming out of the human rights movement. And this responding from that, this whole notion of humanitarian intervention, and this quasi-legal crap that came out with called the responsibility to protect. And people have embraced that and justified that. And you ask a very simple question, who gave you the right? How are you able to operate outside even those structures, those international structures that you have put in place, like the Security Council? You know, that's been accepted as just the way it is because that's what powerful white folks do. And we have the right to, in fact, do it. If we're not prepared to go right to the center of that, then we are going to continue to be susceptible to these kinds of appeals that will result in the U.S. public being galvanized into supporting all kinds of backward imperialist interventions. If you give it a humanitarian sort of bent, you know. So we've got to go right to the heart of, you don't have the right to dictate to any people, any nation. You don't have the right to determine the leadership of any state. Who are you? And for what we're doing in the black community is basically helping people to wake up to the fact that, you know, you definitely don't have any responsibility going off fighting for white folks. We got to be just that clear. You know, we've got to talk about the fact that we talk about the national interest. We're not talking about the national interest of all of us. We're talking about the particular interest of this oligarchy, this minority of the population that is geared toward and committed to upholding white supremacy. And the way they're going to uphold it, or attempting to try to uphold it, is by using the power of their states and using the military to maintain their hegemony. And our responsibility is to be in opposition to this. So this issue of whiteness, we've got to confront. Once again, it is the continued Achilles heel of progressivism and radicalism in the country, in this country and in the West. Why is it that we have, in this economic crisis that we're not coming out of, Instead of us moving to the left, we see in Europe and the US the emergence of fascism or neo-fascism. What is in the culture, in the ideology? We've got to pull the stuff out and deal with it directly in a serious kind of way.
Just a couple of points. What?
Remember Julie's question?
On socialism.
Socialism and peace.
Right. You characterized my comment. You said that I said that in the 30s there was a possibility of an automatic movement towards socialism.
That the socialists thought that if a recession had happened, that,
Yeah.
you know, people would wake up and go toward
Yeah.
socialism instead. It went toward fascism. Why would they even think that it would go toward socialism?
Yeah, actually, if I said that I didn't mean to say that, because that wasn't my position. That's not really what happened in Europe. That basically, coming out of the Depression in Germany, I mean, you had the possibility of a left government, but the particular configuration of power was such that. Well, it's very complicated in terms of why people didn't make certain kind of moves at that particular point in history. But nothing was guaranteed. There's no automatics. And, because of some errors that were made, you had the rise and the consolidation of power of the Nazis. But nothing is guaranteed, even in the conditions we face today. I mean, we've been waiting for, many of us, for 50 years for the crisis among the bourgeoisie, the crisis of governance among the bourgeoisie. And it came, and we weren't ready, So it's those subjective factors, consciousness, organization. If you don't have that, then there's a disconnect between the subjective and the objective, to use those old terms, and nothing happens.
Yeah, just let me do a couple quick points. On the diminishing of the anti-war movement, one of the things is the fact that it is a bipartisan war. You think about it, when UNAC was formed, one of the things we did after the conference was we marched from the conference to a mosque in downtown Albany, because we understood this war on terror had a domestic component, and they were arresting, under Obama, they were arresting Muslims. They were sending the FBI, who for some reason now liberals like the FBI because it's somehow against Trump, but the FBI was sending people into these mosques, and they were getting people to say something or do something or imply something that they could be arrested on. They called it preemptive prosecution because they didn't do anything. They got them to do it, and they arrested hundreds. By the U.S. government's figures, hundreds have been put in jail in special Muslim prisons called communication management units, where they're kept in very harsh conditions. We understood that. However, once Trump was elected with this anti-Muslim position, the Democrats all of a sudden were pro-Muslim. It was a very strange thing. They were against the airport stuff, I mean, I've been organizing demonstrations all my life, and boy, that demonstration on the day after the inauguration, where maybe 1 million showed up in D.C. and hundreds of thousands in cities all around the world, it was an incredible thing. I was there. The power of it was incredible. But all day long, it was covered on the corporate media. Right. I have never seen that before in a demonstration. They wanted you to be there. They wanted you to be against Trump. When they started doing the Muslim ban in the airports, they said, people are going to the airport in JFK in New York to try to stop the Muslim ban, and kept on putting it through Muslim, and then they went everywhere, So we showed up in the Albany airport where I live with several hundred people, and we protested that. They don't do the same thing with anti-war, They're not gonna do that. It would be wonderful because there's huge anti-war sentiment. The majority in this country is against war. If they pushed anti-war actions like that, that would, but that's a bipartisan issue, and that's very critical, in my opinion, to the whole system, to the economic and political system that's going right now, which is why we need an anti-war movement and why we have to spend a lot of time convincing others that are coming out on the streets for the immediate issues that are affecting them, like they're being shut down in their neighborhoods and they're being deported. We have to help bring that understanding. And part of that understanding, I want to say, is I very much agree with what was said about racism. As racism is the basis of war. People in this country, white people in this country, believe that sometimes the United States makes a mistake, and we could convince the United States that it was wrong about Vietnam, or it was wrong about going into Iraq, or something like that. We make a mistake, but we're basically good people, and we care about human life. It's those darker people that don't care about human life, and we have to help them. Help their way out. This is the basis of all of this stuff that goes on, and we have to help make that connection. And that's why it's really an exciting project, as I mentioned. The Black Alliance for Peace is coming up, and I can pledge that UNAC will do everything we can to help that organization form. I want to say one other thing. And that is, which was mentioned about this thing where Trump went to Saudi Arabia as his first foreign trip, and he met with all these princes and kings. I guess that's what calls democracy. None of them elected, or very few of those people were elected, in the pro-imperialist Muslim countries of the world. It's a real dangerous thing. I said I went to NATO. He's trying to form a NATO of those groups. So that they can squash any movement for independence in that whole region. If that happens, what went on in Libya, and going from the most prosperous country in Africa to a dead country where there's continual fighting and despair. You know, people, when they wanted to go to college, it was paid for under Libya. Even if they had to go to another country, it was paid for. And they were given a stipend to live on. When they got married, they were given a place to live. They got free medical care. We don't have that in the United States. There were so many things that they have lost now there. This will happen in one country after another. They will destroy the countries if that alliance comes together under the auspices of U.S. imperialism. And it's a real danger, and it must be stopped. There is an increase, not a decrease, that's going on around the world, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and all over, in terms of the move towards war and imperialist intervention. And we have to watch it, and we have to build a movement against it. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Very quickly, I've remembered I have to respond to my friend's question in terms of membership in the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace is, in fact, a formation being organized for people of African descent. You can be a supporter. There's no problem with that at all. We see ourselves as an emerging people, and we demand the respect in terms of that. Like the same way that, for example, if indigenous folks were organized in some kind of formation, they said this is for indigenous folks. Nobody would say anything, but, you know, so we want the same consideration. We're about building a revolutionary movement, but we also understand that we've got to have we've got to have autonomy, because in the end, we've got to be in a position to be able to protect our own particular interests. That's why we say very clearly that we work with UNAC, because we understand that, you know, we have to build these powerful coalitions, and we are committed to attempting to help to revive the broader anti-war movement. And the vehicle that we see right now is, in fact, UNAC. So we're coming to UNAC as a member or an affiliate, and our commitment is to build this anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement here in this country, but from an independent, organized base.
All right. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if we can get that. We're not going to have enough time. People can keep their questions very, very quick. I know you already went once, so I'd rather get other folks.
I didn't answer. I didn't hear the question. I don't know if they got to my question yet, or have they answered it yet?
You were talking about the pensions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good strategy there.
Let me just say, first of all, I'm a labor person. I've been all my life. I'm a member of the Troy Area Labor Council. We do have a position against war. There was a U.S. labor against the war. It functioned very great under Bush, but it did not function at all under Obama. And really, it was a wing of the Democratic Party, and that's the problem. If there's going to be a labor movement that's going to be effective, it also has to be independent of the Democratic Party. So anyway, I forget which order. I think you were first, so why don't you start?
So I just wanted to, I have a lot of notes here, but I do want to start by saying that I pushed back a little bit on the idea that people aren't responding to this idea that we should not be putting our hands in these other countries and this white right to transformation in other countries. I think I've seen a lot of people who are hands off Syria, wanting to, who are speaking about that, but I think that it just isn't working. And I think that the reason that it's not working is because it's like this what do you call it? The slow moving. What's the word when you're changing things? And they said it has to happen. The gradual. This idea that what it does is it enables the change in the response, right? So kind of like antibiotics, if you take a little bit, but you don't kill it out, then the germs can, reform, and you have to come up with a whole new one. And we're using a lot of these same strategic approaches. I feel like the divestment is not working now. Like it worked before, it's not going to work in the same way now, and especially because the money is fake anyway, and it's been transitioned in a way that there's even more control over the fake money, and all of the fake money is in the hands of the least number of people. So like the divestment thing is not going to be able to be as powerful. The demonstrations, it's not working anymore because we're overdoing it. We've been, just like you said, and it's been co-opted in the same way that, like you described, that the process of this whole moving into these other communities and this whole process that we're doing with this changing of regimes, and it being because we are the good country that's supposed to do that, it was a co-opting of the humanitarian movement, and now this demonstration process and all of this movement work that has worked historically is now being co-opted in order to accomplish the goals of this one party with the two names. And so I feel like we have to be much more extreme in addressing the systematic approach, and also the recognition of the apathy of our communities, the identity politics issues that enable people to be manipulated and moved into whatever direction this system is organizing people to go into through things like this co-opted demonstration movement, the disconnection that we have really established with people from other parts of the world especially, let alone the other people in our own country, and the attachment that we have to the material that has really makes it hard for people to overcome the apathy because they're so dependent on the system and the idea of moving into a better position in the system in spite of everything that's moving us into a worse position. And so I feel like we have to build, we have to actually be putting time into building something completely alternative to these systems that people can actually, if we do get them engaged, like when people are coming to these demonstrations, they're excited regardless of who's organizing, regardless if the Democratic Party is organizing all of these protests in order to move people to support the Democrats against Trump, in the next election so they don't have to do anything. Even if that's what's happening, the people who are showing up at these protests are showing up because they want to make something different happen. And then they have to actually be guided into a different something. They're just kind of showing up and saying, yeah, I'm not alone in how I feel, and then they go back home and they don't have any direction. And we're all organizing, we're all these organizers and leaders that are not giving direction to people, and I think we have to really be driving towards looking at how everything connects, looking at people who are concerned about being shot down in their streets, and show how that connects to the imperialistic movements that are being made across the globe, and show how when we work together to address these things, we actually affect all of it, and then have a place that people can actually go. And I don't know exactly how that gets built, but that we have to be spending our time truly building the alternative system, the alternative process that enables people to go from awakening, which is happening, to actually transforming. And so I don't know if there are ideas around that, but that's what I'm really focused on. I'm very frustrated with all the protesting. I'm very frustrated even just with information, getting information out, because it's overwhelming. It's too much information. But we have to actually create just accessible, transformative steps. And I'm interested in hearing what some of those ideas are.
Maybe, because we don't have a lot of time, maybe why don't you go and answer these questions as they come, and I'm gonna...
Well, why don't we take at least two more?
Okay, one and two, all right?
I wanted to ask you...
This is, by the way, Elsa from Germany.
Yeah, hello.
From
So,
Germany.
yeah, I'm going to ask you in particular, Joe, but all of you, a question that would come from Germany, in essence. The analysis that you put forward, I'm a U.S. citizen living in Germany. I tend to think it's correct. You know, the U.S. imperialism is the great enemy, but there is an inter-imperialistic aspect it's developing, also between the U.S. and even Europe. There is they are even using in Europe Trump to some degree as an excuse for something they have wanted to do before, which is to arm up separately from the U.S. as much as possible. There's talk now of Germany, by some, especially leaders in the CDU, needing its own atomic bombs. And you also have now a new thing breaking, which I'll tell you people more about if you make a little ad. Come to our workshop tomorrow at 12. Breaking news that as of May 31st, German court is going to allow the German government to pursue its plan to work with Israel and have a German-Israeli killer drone with the U.S., with the German drone pilots working out of an IDF air base in Israel, being trained there, but also killing from there. And these drones will be initially used in Afghanistan, but also in Mali. And that it's even such that Israel is saying that the German parliament may not even know what weaponry would be used because it's an Israeli defense secret. And so a little bit, Germany's in the relationship to Israel as Great Britain was initially when they started with drones in the U.S. They had their pilots here. But the whole reason that Germany is being the first country to choose Israeli rather than U.S. drone, and the court case was because the U.S. drone manufacturer General Atomics challenged their choice of Israel, is that Israel will cooperate more with them and sharing technology, sharing know-how, so that they can build a German-European drone by 2025. That is, a joint project of Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, but driven by the German arms industry, which, of course, under the Nazis first developed this technology to begin with, to got the unmanned vehicles and so on. So you see pulling away, and certainly the German peace movement, it's been very hard getting them even involved to demonstrate against Ramstein air base, and so because they are saying the main enemy is our country. All the young people who march around for peace in Germany say German weapons, German money is murdering in the whole world. And Germany is the third largest arms exporter. And the people like Brzezinski saying, the U.S. is actually losing power economically in the whole world in comparison to some countries like China and others. And that's part of the reason for the very nasty turn in the military expansion. So I don't hear any of that. I'm not sure how it would impact the movement here, because the main enemy is in your own country. That's what Carl Liebknecht said, and therefore here we have to be opposing particularly U.S. military. But that's the end. But I was just going to say, how would you work internationally in this way? Because others see the main enemy as being in their country.
One last question.
Sorry, it's too long.
I'll have to make it real short, but I've noticed anomalies in this election where Donald Trump came out against regime change, and it was Donald Trump in 2009 that gave Gaddafi the land to put his tent up so he could address the United Nations, whereas Hillary and the Soros crowd were for regime change. Okay? So you had, at least to rhetoric, Trump was the anti-imperialist, Hillary was the pro-imperialist. And I guess the reason I'm here at this conference is to out the thinly veiled imperialists that this conference has pandered to, the Amy Goodmans, the Michael Moores, and the Jeremy Scahills, and the Linda Saussures who have called for regime change. That's all I want to say.
Yes. I would just say briefly, in terms of my sister's comment about the, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the kind of challenge we have in trying to build a movement and to challenge the prevailing consciousness here in this country. But what you touched on too was the frustration in terms of us not being able to make more headway with the opportunities we have today is really a reflection of the weakness of our movements. The fact that we don't have strong structures that allow some degree of continuity in terms of our internal political educational processes. It's difficult for us to build and expand the kind of radical consciousness we have to build in order to have an effective opposition where you don't have very strong organizations. And we have some that have been around for quite some time and they're struggling. But our task today is to really concentrate on strengthening those structures and building new structures. Because the challenge is long term and we cannot win without organization. And I would say to end this is that when you do have effective organizations, then you have like what we see unfolding in Colombia. I don't know if people have had a chance to follow, because it's not really getting out. There's only a few of us been disseminating the struggles in Colombia over the last 2 weeks. But there's been a national strike in Colombia. And not only a national strike, in the main port city of Buenaventura in Colombia, black folks there is a city that is like 94% black. They shut down the entire city. They didn't shut down the port. They shut down the entire city. You couldn't go in or out. And they've been holding the city basically for the last 2 weeks. Now, we've been inundated with all these images from Venezuela and the glorious struggles of the people for democracy in Venezuela, all throughout the corporate media. How many people see images from Colombia? How many people heard about this until this moment? Never heard of it. And that's one of the few things, that's one of the things that we're doing in the Black Alliance for Peace. Because we have connections, and we've been getting daily briefings in Colombia and also disseminating those images because the corporate press won't cover it. Why? Colombia is a U.S. ally. The President Santos was in D.C. just a few weeks ago with Trump celebrating the so-called peace process in Colombia at the same time that the uprising was percolating in that country. My point, organization is the key. When we have that, then we will see a qualitative improvement in our ability to organize an effective resistance here in this country.
Abayomi, any last words?
Well, I think a lot of this has to do with the changing character of imperialist war since the Vietnam disaster for the ruling class in this country. You had the elimination of the draft in 1973, and that, of course, had an impact. Now we have an economic draft, and there's even limitations in that regard. We saw it in Iraq, Afghanistan, people serving 7, 8, 9 terms in those war theaters. And now there's a reliance on air power. There always was, even during the Vietnam War, but now they are utilizing air power in conjunction with these surrogate armies, many of whom are considered Islamist tendencies. So, we have to shift our analysis, we have to shift our focus to even more deeply penetrate the actual character of imperialism in this period. right now we have a situation where, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, 75 million people are displaced around the world, both internally as well as migrants and refugees. This is the largest displacement since the conclusion of World War II. This has been done under successive administrations, both Republican and Democratic. It accelerated under Obama with the war in Syria, with the war in Yemen. Now we have another war the war in Syria and the war in Libya. Now we have another burgeoning crisis in Yemen. So we have to have a much deeper and more penetrating analysis to, capture what is going on, but at the same time be in a position to mobilize people against these wars.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Good questions. Very good questions, challenges. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. Good conversation.
All right.
What you were saying, I was thinking about, how, like, everybody in the Green Party always says how